Have some papers for some of you. So after class, if you want to grab those, just come with me to my office real quick and we'll grab those. I think that's it for announcements. Next quiz is a week from today. Is that right? Yeah. So our next quiz is a week from today, so just kind of make sure that you're keeping up on the different readings that are getting posted and things like that. We'll pull out of our additional readings and head back to the textbook after we finish this exchange rate stuff today, and maybe a little rollover into Monday. So we'll be back into our textbook readings. So I'll put that up whenever we get back in terms of where we were at there. But we're still kind of finishing up that chapter 1-2 intro with this stuff before we move into some of the more market kind of structure. Okay, so when we left off last time, we were talking about comparative advantage. We were talking about comparative advantage in the real world. And we were making a list of, well, we had talked about what led to comparative advantage, and then we were making a list of why we think, if comparative advantage seems that it works mathematically, it works on the whiteboard here, it works in theory, is it utilized in the real world? And we came up with these reasons of why it may not be. We had 4, we're going to add a 5th one here in just a moment. And then we started talking about the how, and I think that's where we left off. We had talked about the first 2 and maybe defined the 3rd one. So we had the idea of a tariff, effectively a tax on a good, an imported good. We had a quota, effectively a limitation on a good. And then finally we had an embargo. And the embargo was the complete ban of either the good or the trading partner. So effectively, supply within a legitimate market falls to 0. If you remember with the quota, we had a cap on supply. We drew the line where our supply would kind of end, restricted by the government. With the embargo, supply in legal markets falls to 0. An embargo is not incredibly common in the world. I think I gave a couple of examples at the end of class last time. The United States, just sitting on that table is perfect. The United States currently has a trade embargo with North Korea. We currently have a mostly trade embargo with Cuba, although there's been some laxing in that over the past couple of decades. While not quite there yet, the United States and Venezuela are not getting along very well right now, and there's been severe trade restrictions over the past, honestly, even just few months that have been placed on Venezuela. Even before that, but over the past few months, they've really revved up the restrictions in terms of trade with Venezuela. So not quite there yet, but there's definitely a lot of restrictions in place going on. Okay, so that was kind of the how, but now to touch back to this why not. Remember, we had our 4. I want to add a 5th one, and this 5th one we've never really addressed yet. When we made our comparative advantage grids, and we kind of just said, hey, look, we can make trade work. There was the underlying assumption that both countries wanted the goods, right? That was one of our kind of initial assumptions, hey, both countries like A and B, and they value A and B equally. That's not going to be the case in real life. In real life, goods are valued differently. And this valuation of products is going to affect the trade. We also kind of had this assumption when we were talking about comparative advantage, but effectively we were trading goods for goods. You would trade wheat for cotton or fish for wine. And that's just not really done any longer. There isn't that typical barter exchange. Instead, goods are purchased with currency. Now, if you wanted to sell a good to someone overseas, hypothetically, say a lot of you guys probably have some kind of craft or whatever that you make. I know some people can make like water bottles with the cricket or whatever and design them. Yeah, maybe you want to do that. So hypothetically, let's say that there's someone in another country, say Japan, that wants to buy your product. Are you wanting to sell them that product for Japanese currency, for yen? No. You want US dollars for it, which means that there is going to have to be a currency exchange before there can be an item exchange. This valuation of products means not only does the product have to hold value itself, but so too does the currency which the exchange is going to take place in. Enter the exchange rate. Let me give you just the starter definition. The exchange rate is the number of units of one country's currency that is equal to 1 unit of domestic currency. The number of units of one country's currency that is equal to 1 unit of domestic currency. In essence, the exchange rate is the price of foreign currency in dollars. There are two types of exchange rates. There are fixed exchange rates and flexible, or floating is sometimes used. Fixed or flexible exchange rates. A fixed exchange rate occurs when a government-declared exchange rate is maintained by central bank intervention. Again, a fixed exchange rate occurs when a government-declared exchange rate is maintained by central bank intervention. So effectively what happens, kind of the slang term for it is pegging, P-E-G-G-I-N-G. So a country will decide to peg some other country's currency. And the central bank of that nation will change the amount of money that they release into society to either inflate or deflate the domestic currency so that the exchange rate always stays the same. You do tend to notice pegging was much more common whenever currency was more kind of commodity backed by items. We'll get to that later in the semester. It's a little less common today in modern times, but it is still done. So I went and I found some examples. So one of the longest periods of pegging occurred from 1994 to 2005. The Chinese government wanted to maintain a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar so that it stayed at 8.2768 yuan to $1. You don't need to know the exact number. Just 8 to 1, right? So if something happened and there was some change in currency value, maybe the US dollar was starting to have some inflation, well, that would change the value of the US dollar, which would then by default change the exchange rate. So what happened then is if that started to change the exchange rate, the central bank of China, well, they would start inflating their dollar to keep that exchange rate level and maintained. So it stayed at that same, 8 to 1 level. So why would countries do this? The most common reason is that they want to stabilize their economy. If a country has a lot of volatility in their economy, they'll peg a currency of an economy that has, less volatility. So the two most common pegged currencies are the US dollar and the euro, because they're relatively stable. They're also really, really large currencies. There's, trillions of dollars that are in existence. So they can absorb fluctuations a lot better. If we think about it, and again, something that we'll learn more about later, but hopefully you saw a little in your 1900 class, if you think about inflation rates in the United States, they're relatively stable. And I mean, yeah, we had that blip in the 1970s we talked about last class that was kind of an outlier. In fact, if we go back the last 10, 20, 30 or so years, the inflation rates have been relatively stable around 3%. We haven't even hit 3% the last couple of years. So there's a lot of ability to absorb dollar fluctuation with the US dollar, and the same thing with the euro. So it's very common that countries that are having a little bit more stability problems will peg those two currencies, one of those two currencies, to help stabilize their economy. The second kind of exchange rate that we have on the board here is called a flexible exchange rate. It's sometimes called floating, same thing. The flexible exchange rate is one that is determined freely by the forces of supply and demand in the currency market. So whenever you guys looked in your 1900 class at supply and demand graphs, they were always for goods, right? The supply and demand of cars or hot dogs or whatever. Well, there's multiple ways that we can look at markets. In fact, every time that we say a market model, and we'll do several markets, a money market, a loanable funds market, a currency market. Anytime you say a market model, what you're really saying is we want a graph that follows the laws of supply and demand. So they're still effectively behaving exactly like a supply and demand model. So we can build a market model for currency to measure the exchange rate. So I'm going to do this from the US perspective. Briefly, I'll kind of show you a connection between, the idea of the flexibility between two different markets. But for the most part, we're going to look at this from a US perspective. So when we model, this is going to be quantity of US dollars. Our vertical axis is going to be our measure for the exchange rate. What we want to know is how much currency can you get for $1 US. So the typical designation for that is F over the dollar sign. It's just, this is our exchange rate. The F over the dollar sign effectively means the amount of foreign currency per $1. Okay, so we said this is going to follow the laws of supply and demand, so let's put a demand curve on here. So this is demand. Demand of what? Well, our model is US dollars, so this is the demand for US dollars in exchange for some foreign currency. Again, F, the foreign currency, whatever that may be. So I went ahead and drew the downward slope following the law of demand, right? Well, what we want to kind of think about is as this value goes down, as this number goes down, this F per dollars goes down, effectively the dollar becomes cheaper, and foreigners will want to buy more US dollars so they can buy more US goods. If it's cheaper to get dollars, it's easier to obtain them, they'll want more of them. So they can buy more stuff from the US sellers. So it still follows the law of demand. Okay, so what about supply? Well, we want supply to be our upward sloping function. Right? And in this case, in this model, this is now the supply of US dollars from people willing to exchange for the foreign currency. And again, if we think about the slope, we followed the law of supply, upward sloping function, right? But effectively what it's saying is if as this price per dollar goes up, as you're able to buy more and more and more foreign currency with each dollar, you would be willing to supply your dollars to this market more so you can obtain higher and higher and higher levels of foreign currency. So again, we still expect the supply to follow that law of supply relationship. You'll notice that they have some equilibrium point. And I'll just make this 100. So mathematically, what does this mean if we kind of connect these two? We're saying 100 over 1. Or that 1 US dollar is exchangeable for 100 units of foreign currency. Right? Foreign currency per dollar. You get 100 units for each dollar. So, just like we saw in our supply and demand graphs in 1900, these models can change, and that change is then going to impact the exchange rate. In a flexible or floating exchange rate, the exchange rate changes, honestly, it changes daily. Even within a day, it's changing somewhat rapidly. So we want to kind of talk about some of those changes. So I went through, and this is not an exclusive, exhaustive, end-all, be-all list. This is like 2 things. We actually have a whole class, it's a semester-long class that talks about trade and the exchange rate. So we're going to wrap it up into a day, so my list better be kind of small. So I kind of gave you probably the most common shifters that we'll see. So for demand, probably the very most common shifter for demand is going to be foreign income. And maybe the second one would be the domestic interest rate. So I kind of think the easiest way to think about this is if we start from this foreign income perspective. So if anyone sees their income go up, whether they be domestic, whether they be foreigners, whatever, they're going to buy more stuff, right? If you guys get a higher income, you're going to start buying more stuff overall. We don't even have to think about normal or inferior, just think overall, right? You're going to buy more things. Some of those things are going to be produced within your own country, and some of those things are going to be produced outside of your country. So if your income goes up, we know you're going to buy more stuff from foreign countries, just by default. If you want to buy more stuff from foreign countries, you're going to demand their currency. So if foreign incomes are going to go up, we know that by default they're going to buy more of their own goods and more US goods. And if they buy more US goods, they're going to need more US dollars. Thus, foreign income increasing would cause the demand to also increase. And we can show that on our model. I'm going to be kind of lazy here and just erase some of my stuff around this so I can fit it in here. We can show it on this model here as effectively shifting the demand curve to the right to D2. And you'll notice our end result, sure enough, more currency is traded, as we would expect, just Q1 to Q2, not worried about values there. But you'll notice that drives up the value further from the origin, so maybe this becomes 120 at this point. Meaning now 1 US dollar can get you 120 of foreign currency. They have extra money abroad. People want to buy US products. Well, it's going to take more and more of their extra money. We call this currency appreciation. The US dollar appreciates. Maybe still save me a room on shifters, but I'll give you a definition for this right now. Currency appreciation is the increase in the value of one currency relative to another. The increase in value of one currency relative to another. So if you've ever heard the phrase, people say like, oh, the US dollar has become stronger, this is what they're referring to. They're not referring to any kind of domestic purchasing at all. They're referring to the US dollar's strength in exchange relative to other currencies, the rest of the world, or maybe one specific country. Whenever people say the US dollar becomes stronger, they're saying the US dollar is appreciating. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means we do tend to import more products. When the US dollar appreciates, we import more, and we tend to export a little bit less. If the US dollar is getting stronger relative to other nations, our dollar is able to buy more goods in other nations. So we would take advantage of that. And we're going to get more and more and more goods from countries. As the dollar appreciates more and more, it starts to slow this demand pressure. Things start getting more and more expensive. It takes more and more foreign currency to get $1, and thus countries don't want as many U.S. exports. So we start to see exports start to decline a little bit. That means this has a little bit of implication. A strong U.S. dollar, hey, it's great for travel. Whenever you plan your spring break trip, you want to go somewhere where the US dollar is getting stronger and stronger and stronger because, quite frankly, you're going to be able to buy more stuff with it. It is, however, bad for domestic jobs because if the US dollar is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, we're going to export less and less and less and import more and more and more, which means buying less, having less people working domestically and more people working overseas. So we actually see that strong US dollar, like I said, well, it's a great time to travel, but it tends to put some pressure on the job market in the United States. And it might lead towards some reductions in domestic production and domestic employment then. Okay, so that's kind of one demand shifter and its kind of side effect. Let's talk about this other one, the domestic interest rate. Effectively, it's going to behave the same way. So the interest rate, you get an interest rate when you put money into the bank, right? You put money in your savings account, you get some interest rate, and that'll work for now. If the U.S. has a higher interest rate, people would want to invest in U.S. banks. Well, again, U.S. banks only take U.S. dollars. So higher interest rates, foreigners say, well, I would like to invest in the U.S., I need some US dollars to put into a US bank to take advantage of that. So an increase in the interest rate domestically tends to lead to an increase in the demand for US dollars. Both of these would work in reverse, by the way. Foreign incomes fall, demand for US dollars falls. It works, and they both work in reverse. Trying to copy an interest rate table or exchange rate table for you guys if I can. It's too small as is. Okay, what about supply shifters? Again, this is not the end-all, be-all list. But we can look at each of these in effect and determine supply effects as well. For example, a supply shifter would be domestic income. And a supply shifter would be the foreign interest rate. Okay, and if we think about domestic income, we're basically just going to tell the story in reverse. I don't know where the little rag is, so Unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep using this, which starts to stain it a little bit. We can think about kind of the demand story in reverse, if you will. If domestic incomes are rising, you have more income, more money, and more ability to supply the foreign exchange market. You're going to buy more goods from overseas, which means you're going to effectively be converting that dollars into foreign currency and supplying more US dollars into that conversion matrix. So effectively, an increase in domestic income increases the supply of US dollars within this market. And again, we can kind of measure that effect. So if I increase the supply of US dollars, there's more US dollars being added to the exchange market. Supply shifts to S2 because an increase in supply is a leftward shift. As we expect, sure enough, the amount of transactions increase. More money, more people buy stuff, so more transactions. And you'll notice that now this puts downward pressure on the exchange rate. We call this depreciation. Currency depreciation is the decrease in value. Of one currency relative to another. The decrease in value of one currency relative to another. From like US dollar point of view, if you ever hear anyone say, oh, the US dollar is becoming weaker, that's what's happening. We're seeing US currency depreciate relative to other nations. And again, there's kind of goods and bads to that. There's not one ever set, oh, it's only good or it's only bad. Because we do have some goods from this. Whenever the US dollar depreciates, we tend to export more products. If if the dollar is getting weaker, effectively the goods in the US, foreigners can buy more and more of them. It's kind of like a price reduction. And if they're able to buy more and more of them, the United States exports more and more and more of them. This is great for jobs, because if we're producing a lot of goods that we're selling overseas, we've got to hire workers to do that. So we tend to notice that depreciation of the currency actually increases job growth in the United States. Now, again, it's a two-sided coin. It's not all good. U.S. currency depreciation means it is much more difficult to buy imported products. So we tend to notice that there is some effective price rise on imported products. This would be your bad time to travel, because you're not going to get as much bang for your buck overseas. U.S. dollar's not going to buy you as much. It's not going to go as far. So again, there's two different kind of ways of looking at that, if you will. And just to kind of finish our little thing over there. So if the foreign interest rate is rising, let's say hypothetically there's a higher interest rate in Europe than you could get maybe in the United States, what would you want to do? Well, forget depositing it into your savings account that's drawing under 0.5%. Let's put that money in a European account. Let's put it in a German account. They're getting 3%. They don't want US dollars. They want euros, which means that if the interest rate overseas is high, you're going to have to supply your dollars to get euros in exchange for that currency. So, same kind of thing. If the foreign interest rate is rising, the supply of US dollars that's going into this market for exchange is going up. More people are saying, here, take my money, convert it to euros so I can deposit it in the bank. And both of those work in reverse as well. Okay, so we now have some kind of measured model, if you will, for our exchange. What I thought I would do really quick is show you some of the exchange rates. That helps at all. See if I can turn out some of these front ones and maybe make it a little darker. So this is a pretty common site. This is I think it's X-Rates is what it is. Yeah, xrates.com. It's a pretty common just tabling site that shows the exchange rate of the US dollar. I just figured it was too small, so I copied it into Word really quick so I can make that bigger easily. So at the top, it's got some of the more common exchange rates, and then after that, it's got them in alphabetical order. So you can kind of always see it. So effectively, we have 1 US dollar. How much is that in a foreign currency? So 1 US dollar gets you 0.88 euros. That's actually kind of close. For a while, the euro was significantly stronger than the US dollar. Where 1 US dollar would get you about a half a euro for a little bit. So they've kind of gotten a little bit closer over time. So Britain has effectively left the European Union. They're not trading in euros, although you could always still buy British pounds. They never fully kind of engaged. But their exchange rate, 0.77, so $1 gets you 0.77. But then if you look at some of these other countries here, of Japanese yen, down a little bit, 1 US dollar gets you 110 approximately yen. And then you'll notice, what does that mean in terms of the inverse here? Well, effectively, if we have one axis that represents foreign currency over dollars, if we wanted to look at this from a reversed perspective, we could. We could look at it as dollars per foreign currency. So I should have an approximate reciprocal between the two. So 0.009 is the value of a yen relative to a dollar investment. The Swiss franc looks like it's trading pretty much about evenly at a 1-to-1. Mexican peso, is it not on our list? I guess not. We'll have to scroll down a little bit. There we go. Mexican pesos, about 19-to-1, so 1 US dollar gets you about 19 pesos. Mexico was another country that in the 80s was pegging the US dollar because they were having a significant amount of inflation. So much so that in the maybe early 90s, I would almost have to look it up, they actually redid their whole currency structure. What they introduced, this is what at the time was called the Nuevo Peso, the new peso. They've since dropped that in terms of terminology because it's been 30 years since they did that, 20 years plus. But they actually had to kind of redo the entire exchange rate because the exchange rate was getting such an incredibly large gap. So if you were to kind of, I think from the actual site, not the Word document here, but you could actually pull up a history of that and you can see that there was a huge gap, so much so that they actually had to redo their currency. China did that too at one point. They had to kind of redo their currency. And whenever we get into some of our modeling with the different countries and their different GDP rates, you actually can pick it up because it was enough to actually affect their entire GDP. So it's just kind of a neat site. Like I said, it's xrates.com. It's a good thing. Anytime you're going to go travel somewhere, pull it up. You'll be able to see what the exchange rate is. They update it super regularly, multiple times a day. So you'll always have a good idea of what the exchange rates are. Now, that's not always the exchange rate you receive. And that's something that we'll talk about here in just a second. Let me go ahead and mute this. Why it's on this board? Anyone have this classroom where your teacher uses this board? They use this board?
Yeah.
Oh, that's got to be super inconvenient. Okay, so I'm going to erase this really quick and just kind of put on kind of that inverse relationship that I was talking about, because it's a good segue to our next topic on these indexes. And so, right, we are looking at the model from this perspective of quantity of US dollars relative to some foreign currency per dollar, right? And that's going to give us some value. You know, effectively our 100 over 1. Well, we can actually flip this around because, in theory at least, these should be a reciprocal relationship. So if I had the quantity of foreign currency, I could then look at the dollars per foreign currency. And in theory, if this is $100 for one, or 100 foreign currency for $1, then I would have $1 per 100 foreign currency, or the decimal 0.01. So when we were looking at that Japanese yen, which was pretty close to 100, it was what, 109, and it was pretty close to 0.01. It was 0.0009 something, right? So pretty darn close. In theory, that seems like it should make sense. That these values effectively would be the reciprocal of one another. So if the US dollar appreciates in terms of value, a foreign currency would be depreciating. Right? We'd have some 120 over 1, or some smaller decimal 1 over 120. So again, we're not going to worry too much about the implications and change of that market. There's a whole semester that does it. But you can effectively see that, well, if one is appreciating, the other is going to depreciate, and in theory, they should always just match up. And you should always be able to buy the same goods with the same currency, effectively anywhere in the world, subject to, of course, availability. Right, so think about that. If we take two countries, maybe that are especially close together, the United States and Mexico, and both countries have roughly the same access to goods, something that both countries could sell. You know what, there's a McDonald's in both countries. So in theory, if we go to a McDonald's, I think there's one just down the street right here, we could get the price of a value meal. They're like $6 or something now. After the exchange rate for Mexican pesos, it should cost the same amount. The two countries are relatively close together with relatively similar market structures. Should cost the same thing. Now the Mexican peso, according to our site, was trading at 19 to 1 approximately. So it should cost, what, 114 pesos for the same value meal. Does it? Well, we don't find that to be the case. So while our math seems to just be beautiful and it's a perfect reciprocal and trade should be super easy, we don't always find that you have the same what we call purchasing power with your dollar. It's a very common, albeit somewhat, informal study to test the accuracy of exchange rates is by using the theory of purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity. Or PPP. So the idea behind this PPP is that in equally efficient markets, there should only be one price for a good after exchange. The good should have one price. So if we look at the nominal exchange rates, can you buy identical goods? If we look at these exchange rates, can you buy identical goods in different countries? For the same real price or real exchange rate? And what this allows us to determine is whether or not a country is domestically overvaluing or undervaluing their currency. Because if and what we'll find is I just don't think that we'll find anywhere that you have that exact, where the real and nominal effectively are the same, so that there's going to be some measure of over or undervalue for each country. And there's a lot of ways that they can test this. Now, there are some rules, right? In order to actually truly test whether a country's currency is over or undervalued, you have to have goods that are available in multiple countries with relative ease of purchase. It also has to be generally produced at the same price, no matter where it's made. So they've actually been able to test this, and they found some goods that, while not perfectly, because nothing will perfectly fit the criteria, at least fit it close enough where they feel they can run a substantial test. The most famous one of these is known as the Big Mac Index. The Big Mac Index. Big Mac Index goes back to 1986, so you guys weren't even born when it was first introduced. And it actually was introduced as a joke. It was in the Economist magazine. Now, I mean, come on, it's an Economist magazine, so the jokes aren't funny anyway. But it was introduced effectively as a joke, so that economists, when they read these, they get a kick out of it. They laugh because, well, we know this theory just doesn't work great. But it was actually really popular, and it was something that not only caught on with people in the field, but actually caught on with the media as well, as a way to kind of measure currency. Effectively, they still track it, so it was so popular that it's still something they do annually. So effectively what they did is they went and said, okay, you can get a Big Mac almost everywhere in the world. And in terms of cost of production, production value, it is relatively close. Now there are some variances, but they measured it out as essentially an unskilled labor production. And so that's going to have less variance than skilled labor, by far. So they said, okay, yeah, there's going to still be a little bit of variance in labor cost. There's probably still going to be some variance in ingredient cost, but again, not much per unit. So the belief is that, well, a Big Mac should probably cost the same everywhere in the world within a few cents after you adjust for the exchange rate. So if it costs $3 in the United States and the exchange rate in Mexico is 20 to 1, it should cost 60 pesos approximately. Again, they give it a few cents. There's some differences. And what do we see? The Swiss franc was trading 1 to 1. It should cost $3 in Switzerland. And if the euro is trading at 0.5, well, it should cost $1.50, 1.5 euros. It should be the same value. And they found that it's just not even remotely close. Like, there was not one country that had the same value. And there were very few countries that had the within the cents rule. So it definitely looks like that there's some problems, at least with valuing currency and that exchange rate. Here, real quick, just you don't have to write these down, but these are just some other funny ones that I found whenever I was just kind of researching these. And I just tell you in the last minute here. So other indexes that they use to measure the purchasing power parity, they have a Starbucks tall latte index. a Coca-Cola index, Coca-Cola, and I could not find a Pepsi one. And I don't know why, but I do think that Coca-Cola is more popular worldwide. So I think that's the case. And then they have Apple has got about every Apple product index. They've got an iPad, an iPod, an iPhone. So basically, if it has been produced by Apple, there is a tracking index worldwide for it. So those are just some interesting ones that I found. All right, that's where we'll kind of draw our line. Maybe we'll look at this. We'll see how we're doing time-wise. Maybe we'll look at some examples next time, super briefly, before we move back into lecture.